Hello everyone. These are the notes for Chapter 17, Section 3, the English Exception. There's something different about England and the age of absolutism. That's why it's called the English Exception, and you'll understand why in a little bit. This is Part 1 of Chapter 17, Section 3, the English Exception. Here before you have a couple of images. The first one on the left is Henry VIII. He is part of the Tudor dynasty, Henry Tudor. And we have on the right Elizabeth I. She's also a Tudor, once again. She is, from what we've talked about before, she is the daughter of Henry VIII. Now you can see that the Tudor dynasty in the middle here reigned from 1485 to 1603, and they both believed in what's called divine right. Divine means godly, from God, and the right to rule. So God's right to rule on earth here. Divine right they believed in. Now, Elizabeth I, the daughter, was also referred to as the Virgin Queen. Once again, she never got married. Virginia is actually named after her as well, the Virgin Queen. And when she died in 1603, that was the end of the Tudor dynasty as well. Now, both of these two very powerful rulers valued a good relationship with Parliament. Now, once again, Parliament is the idea of the English Congress, if you will. So our Congress, government, if you will, Parliament is called over there. Okay? So our story begins with the death of Queen Elizabeth I in 1603. So she dies, and once again, she never marries and never has a child. So therefore, what happens then? Who becomes King, Queen of England? There's no heir to the throne. So there's a problem. And so what happens is, after some time, they decide, Parliament, people in the know, they finally decide on someone called James. Now, James, this guy James, is the cousin of Elizabeth I. Now, he is, first and foremost, King James VI of Scotland. King James VI of Scotland. Now, at this time, Scotland was a separate entity, a separate idea. Okay? It wasn't until 1707 with the Acts of Union or the Treaty of Union that all three parts, you can see this, the map on the right, you see where the yellow is? That is Scotland. The pink is England, and the purple is Wales. It wasn't until the Acts of Union in 1707 that all three of them would come and make up Great Britain there. So, at first, James VI, he is King of Scotland in the north there. Now, when they ask him to become King of England, he then also becomes King James I of England. In other words, the first king of England that's named James. So James I. Now, his last name is Stuart. So therefore, as you can see here, the Stuart dynasty begins with King James I of England in 1603. And as you can see on the painting, his years of reign was from 1603 to 1625. He also believed in divine right greatly, actually, as well. Now, right from the beginning of his rule in 1603, King James I, the first Stuart king, he clashed greatly with Parliament. And once again, Parliament is the law-making body in England. And he clashes with Parliament over money and over foreign policy. King James I openly declares divine right. He clashes with the Puritans, the religious group that tried to purify the Anglican Church. They actually would leave and go to the Netherlands first, then actually would come to America later on during his reign. Now, what he does in 1610 is King James I actually dissolves Parliament. That means he gets rid of Parliament. He doesn't listen to Parliament. It's non-existent to him. So from 1610 to 1622, for 12 years, Parliament is not there anymore. And it was they clashed greatly with King James I, but he just gets rid of them. Now, fast forwarding to 1625, we have someone called Charles I. Now, Charles I is the son of James I. So in 1625, James I, the first Stuart king, dies, and his son Charles becomes King of England. Charles I. Now, Charles I was also into divine right and absolute monarchy. In other words, he has absolute control. He proclaims to be an absolute monarch. Divine right is the key. He is in charge, and that's it. So you can well imagine he also, like father, like son, clashes with Parliament. By this time, Parliament is back, and what happens is he's again clashing with Parliament, just like his dad, over money and over foreign policy as well. Now, 3 years into his reign, in 1628, Charles I is forced to sign what's called the Petition of Right. So 3 years into his reign, he signs the Petition of Right. He's pretty much forced to sign it. Why would he sign this? Well, if he wanted to get anything from Parliament to work with, they forced him to sign this. And he was finding that he kind of needed them a little bit. So therefore, what was the Petition of Right? These were laws that prohibited the king from raising taxes without asking Parliament. So the people of Parliament were tired of the king just raising taxes, not going through Parliament. Parliament has the power of the purse. I don't know if you've heard of that phrase before. In other words, deals with the money. So once again, the Petition of Right was a set of laws that prohibited the king from raising taxes without asking Parliament. Parliament can raise taxes, not the king. What does this do for the king? Overall, what it does is it's again starting to take a little bit power away from the king. And some of these kings, including Charles I, don't like this. They want complete control, absolute monarch, divine right type of ideas. So, as time goes on in 1629, Charles I starts to ignore the Petition of Right and rules without Parliament, once again, just like his dad. He gets rid of Parliament again for 11 years. It keeps on coming and going, from 1629 to 1640. He doesn't listen to Parliament. He has no dealings with Parliament. Now, the year is 1640. Charles I is still there, and get this, he brings back Parliament in 1640. The question is, why? Well, he needs money. He needs money to fight a war between England and France, and also to stop a rebellion in his native homeland of Scotland. So he needs something. So he has Parliament back and starts to deal with them. Now, this idea of bringing back Parliament began what was called the Long Parliament period from 1640 to 1653. What was the Long Parliament period? Well, the main idea is, with Parliament always coming and going, Parliament itself declared the following: Parliament declared that Parliament cannot be dissolved without the consent of Parliament itself. Once again, let me say that again. Parliament itself declared that Parliament cannot be dissolved without the consent of Parliament itself. So they cannot just go away without their consent. It's kind of weird to think, but they're voting, and they came up with Parliament itself, us, cannot go away until we say it's okay. In other words, the king cannot just say, you must leave, we're not listening to you anymore, go away. The idea of it has to come from within Parliament. Once again, what does this do? Again, it starts taking power away from the king, a little at a time. King Charles I does not like this, obviously. So finally, things start coming to a head, and in 1642, an explosive event depicted in this John Singleton Copley painting of King Charles I. He goes to the House of Commons within Parliament and tries to arrest the radical leaders in Parliament. These radical leaders escape out the back door, and this whole issue here was the spark plug that ignited what was referred to as the English Civil War. Now, the English Civil War from 1642 to 1649 was very bloody and brutal. Once again, a civil war is a war within the same country, the same people. We've had one here called the American Civil War. You might have heard of that before. Well, England also had their own civil war. Now, there were two sides to this civil war. On one side were the Cavaliers. Now, the Cavaliers were supporters of Charles I. So it's Charles I's people, sympathizers that liked the king and liked the monarchy. Traditionalists. On the other side were what was referred to as the Roundheads. From your book, it mentioned something about the type of hat that they wore around their heads. So the Roundheads were supporters of Parliament. These were more of the supporters of the people. And the Roundheads were led by a guy by the name of Oliver Cromwell. So now you have Charles I versus Oliver Cromwell, the Cavaliers versus the Roundheads. So supporters of Charles I and supporters of Cromwell and Parliament. That's the end of part 1. We'll pick up with the story in part 2 later.